Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Let's Go Channel Surfing. Ranger Tug holds an annual rendezvous in Roach Harbor in September. They had over 215 boats this past September of 2022. Yamaha gave a fantastic presentation about the Yamaha F300, the F250, and the F200, which are the three main engines that they outfit on their boats. In this video, I'm going to go over my notes that I took from that session. If you find this video helpful, please consider hitting that like button and clicking subscribe, as it really helps us out a lot. So talk about oil changes. Perform oil changes every 100 hours. I was very adamant about that. Also, do not use Pennzoil, Amsoil, Quaker, anything you pick up from AutoZone. Use Yamalube. It's not a synthetic oil, but it is specially formulated for saltwater environments in a Yamaha 4-stroke engine. Automobile engines generally run about 2,500 RPM. The Yamahas run at 5,000 RPM. The oil analysis that I had done at the 400-hour mark on Channel Surfing's engine stated that given our current usage, I could probably go about 125 hours between oil changes, but I'll stick with the 100-hour interval to stay within the boundaries of the engine warranty. Do not put in the amount of oil that's on the label on the top of the engine. This sounds counterintuitive. He's pretty adamant about that. He says fill with the oil until the oil is halfway between the holes on the dipstick, which is probably about a half a quart short of what the label actually reads. There's a specific reason for this. If the engine runs cold, such as a stuck open thermostat, and there's two thermostats actually on the F300 and F250, or if you do a lot of low-speed idling, which we actually do on Channel Surfing, believe it or not, we don't always run 25 knots. The engine will actually do what's called, it'll make oil. I know some of you watching this have actually had that happen to you. Where does the engine get the oil from? It's actually not oil. Fuel actually will get into the oil, right? So you've got to make sure there's enough room in that oil pan for the fuel to go in there, should that occur. That's the reason why it's super important not to overfill the oil on the engine. So how do you get the fuel out of the oil? Because obviously that dilutes the oil, and that's not good either. Open up the throttles for at least 10 to 15 minutes at wide open throttle, and that'll burn off any of the fuel that gets into the oil. And that's a recommendation directly from the Yamaha representative to do that. So if you're doing a lot of slow boating, he said at least 10-15 minutes of your trip, just open her wide up, right? And that'll flash all that fuel and burn it all off out of the oil. He says this is why it's super important not to overfill the engine with oil. So stick with, look at the two holes in the dipstick. I mean, they're quite a distance. I would say probably 3 inches apart, maybe. Get it right in the halfway point is where it needs to be. The lower unit. Change the lower gear oil annually or every 100 hours. The way the shaft seals are made on the lower unit, they said, was they're actually designed to vent pressure out. So if any kind of pressure builds up in the gear casings, it'll actually vent outwards, right, through the two shaft seals, one for the propeller, one for the drive shaft. Problem with that is that will cause oil to vent out of the system as well. So that'll cause the level of oil in the lower unit to decrease, right? This could actually starve the upper bearing of oil and could ultimately cause a failure in the lower unit. He said, the tech said you could opt to just add oil to the lower unit at 100 hours and just make sure it's topped off, but that still requires the boat to be out of the water. And if the boat's out of the water, you might as well just change it. It's not likely that the oil will even look used. I know most of the time when I change the lower unit oil, it looks like new oil coming out of the engine. Well, unless one of the seals was to leak, in which case then it'll look milky because now water is getting through the seal into the lower unit, and you'd like to know that so you could get that fixed. This is why I replace the lower unit gear oil every 100 hours regardless. Change out the impeller at least annually. This is the water pump on the lower unit. if for no other reason than to take the lower unit apart and prevent the parts from seizing together permanently from being assembled and submerged in salt water. Right? I've been doing this every 100 hours, but we're actually putting about 250 hours a year on channel surfing. So I'm going to switch and do the impeller just annually. It makes more sense that way just because we're putting such high usage on it. But if you think about the inverse of this, is let's say you only put 30 hours on your boat. You may say, I don't need to do the impeller. It's going to be almost new. It's got 30 hours on it. You want to take things apart and put them back together so they're taken apart easily and go back together easily. If you leave them sit in the marine environment, those parts will eventually seize up and make a simple job a much more complicated and expensive job. Change out the entire water pump housing at least every 3 years. Visually, the Yamaha rep said you probably won't notice a difference. He says do it anyway. Just replace the entire water pump housing. You can do this yourself and actually make a kit for it. Parts View I know sells it. It's not that hard. I will say, doing as a do-it-yourselfer, the lower unit is definitely the most complicated work of all the maintenance to the engine. The upper part of the engine, spark plugs, oil changes, is all easy, but the lower unit's a little bit more technical. But it's certainly easily doable by a do-it-yourselfer. The crankcase and thermostat anodes. So there's 8 crankcase anodes and there's 2 thermostat anodes. The service manual says to inspect them every 100 hours and replace them every 500 hours. If you flush your engine regularly, the Yamaha rep said they should last a long time. And you should flush your engine every chance you get, especially right after a trip. The best time to flush the engine is when the engine is hot. And if that's not possible, run the engine using earmuffs at idle to get it up to temp. I flush channel surfing after every trip when we get back to our home slip. Just adjust the water pressure. It comes out right here. The reason to do it while it's hot is if you think about it, when you put water on a hot metal, it'll flash off, right? So, you know, you pull in to your slip, you turn the engine off, it's hot, the water falls out of it, and whatever was there will flash off, and then you'll just end up with the salt and everything stuck to all the metal. That's why you need to flush it while the engine is still hot. Another tip he too, and this one I didn't know, he says use the tilt and cycle the engine up or down at least twice while flushing to make sure to get fresh water throughout the entire engine. So there's no pockets for seawater to collect in. So just to do that, you know, take it up or down 2 or 3 times while you're flushing it through the flushing port. Use Yamaha Shield several times, he said. It's like a silicone spray. It's always the last thing I do before putting the cowling cover back on the engine. I just spray it all over the whole engine. It helps against corrosion, all the electrical components and stuff. It's actually in our 100-hour maintenance video. If you've not watched that, I highly recommend that, and click right here. Gasoline, this was a biggie. Do not use ethanol. This is actually somewhat challenging. I know in the Puget Sound, there's a small number of fuel docks that only have ethanol fuel for gas. Most of them are ethanol free. On land, if you're trailing your boat, gas is always cheaper on land than at a fuel dock, but on land, it's really hard to find non-ethanol fuel. So what's the problem with ethanol? Ethanol attracts water. Boats are surrounded by water. Water doesn't burn. Ethanol is also an octane boost. So 87 octane fuel with 10% ethanol is actually 85 octane gas, not 87. Right, the ethanol will separate from the fuel over time. That's not good either for the engine. So the recommendation is just don't use ethanol if you can avoid it. If you have to use ethanol, burn it fast. Don't leave ethanol sitting in the tank for weeks and weeks on end. I mentioned changing your primary fuel filter every 50 hours. Change the secondary fuel filter every 100 hours. This one I had some fun with because when you look at the Yamaha service manuals, they reference primary fuel filter, right? There's 2 fuel filters. They have the gas tank in the cockpit that runs into the canister fuel filter, which is the primary fuel filter because that's the first fuel filter that the fuel hits before it goes back to the engine. And then at the front of the engine is it's a little small fuel filter. The service manual refers to that as the primary fuel filter because in the context of the engine, that's the only fuel filter that's there. So hence it's the primary. But it makes it confusing on primary, secondary, which is which, right? So anyway, the fuel filter, the canister fuel filter in the cockpit, call that primary, should be changed every 50 hours. Really important. We don't want contaminants. We don't want water in our fuel. Right. The fuel filter on the engine should be changed with your normal 100-hour service. One other tip, and this one I hadn't heard of, was if your engine alarm sounds a half second on and then off and then back on again in neutral only, that means, he says, that's the only alarm you'll ever get from the Yamaha where the alarm goes on, off, half a second intervals while you're in neutral. He says that means you've got water present in your secondary fuel filter cup, right? That's the fuel filter on the engine. Now, I would say if you've got water that made it all the way back there, it means it's already bypassed the canister. You should replace both fuel filters to make that error, alarm go away. Excessive idling will make oil. That also creates carbon buildup and cylinder glazing and scuffing. We're all going to run the boats at slow speeds and put too many low hours on the engine. Channel Surfing just had the 500-hour maintenance done. It's actually we're at 535 hours. And that was one of the things the Yamaha dealer, he downloaded the hours. The engine keeps logs of how much time I spend at each RPM. And he noted out of the 535 hours, 108 hours was spent below 2,000 RPM. Right? That's low idle. So the problem with that is that the engine could potentially make oil, could have carbon buildup. And the dealer asked me, he's like, hey, you should really run ring-free. I'm like, well, I already do run ring-free. Ring-free comes in a quart container like this. It's just a fuel additive. I always keep a couple quarts on the boat when I'm at the fuel dock. You know, however many gallons I put in is what I put in the ring-free to match it. I will say that ring-free is somewhat expensive per quart, especially when you compare it to fuel stabilizer. However, fuel stabilizer is a 1 to 3 mix, so 1 ounce to every 3 gallons of gas, and ring-free is 1 to 10. So if you do the math on cost for how much gallons of gas you're treating, they're actually pretty comparable in price between stabilizer and ring-free. So I run ring-free almost every fill up. If I'm going to burn the gas quick and I know I'm running, then I may skip it. But in general, you know, especially during shellfish season, we do a lot of crabbing and shrimping. That's where the 108 hours of slow boating is shrimping, crabbing, and no wake zones for us. Because most every other time we're cruising 25 knots. So recommendation from Yamaha was use ring-free and run the boat at wide open throttle for at least 5 to 10 minutes to flash the fuel. He made no qualms about it. Do not be bashful. You can run these engines wide open throttle. You're not going to hurt them. They actually like that, right? Generally speaking, you know, the Yamaha dealer specifically on the variations of the RPM that I run at, I fluctuated quite a bit. So while I have 108 hours of slow boating, the rest of the RPMs was all varied, you know, between wide open throttle and less. Generally, I'm running 5,000, 5,200 RPM most of the time. I got some 4,000 RPM, 4,500 in there as well. And that's it for my notes. If you have any questions, please be sure to leave them in the comments section below. And thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed watching this video, click the screen to watch another.